Hello, everyone. This is Jim Daly with Madison Wealth Managers. I'm here with Rick Lane today. I'm going to touch base on fiduciary best practices. Just a little housekeeping information to start out. First, we'd like to thank all of you for attending. And we'd also like to thank Tim Foley and the Healthcare Executive Network for offering us an invitation to present on this topic. Regarding just how we're going to have it all set up, everyone is actually going to be on mute just because the background noise will probably become too much with the number of people who are registered. If you have a question, feel free to go under the questions tab. It's probably on your right-hand side towards the bottom. You can type a question in there, or if you're having an issue hearing us or something, feel free to put any comments in there. And most of the questions, if they're in kind of in a timely manner of the topic or the piece of the topic that we're speaking on, we'll address it then. If not, we'll address them all at the end. Let's see. All right. There's a good number of people in. There's still quite a few expected, but we're going to start now just because we don't want to run over and hold people up. So I'm going to turn it over to Rick and have him do the kickoff piece.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, everybody. We're going to speak today on the topic of retirement plans in 2018. You know, it's an ever-changing world at this point in time, and it's changing daily almost. But our objectives today are going to be identify who serves as the plan fiduciary. Sometimes there's a misconception that it's one person that you can point at and say, you are the fiduciary. But in fact, the fiduciary or a number of people can serve as fiduciaries on the same plan. So we're going to identify that today. Then we're going to take a look at asset-based fees versus commission-based fees. So in light of the Department of Labor 408B2 ruling that went into effect in 2013, and then also in light of this ever-changing fiduciary rule, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, we're going to take a look at the different types of fees within retirement plans. And last but not least, we're going to take an in-depth look at benchmarking your plan. Benchmarking is one of the greatest tools you have in your arsenal to make sure you are in compliance and also make sure you are relevant in the space of retirement plans. And this could help you insulate yourself from any sort of litigation issues that may arise, and we'll touch on a lot today of what has happened, who has been in the crosshairs, how many companies. So that's really what we'll look at today. First and foremost, let's jump right in. Are you a fiduciary? First of all, we need to know what a fiduciary means, what a fiduciary is, who is a fiduciary. And we're going to look at a legal definition of fiduciary and what that really means to you who are sitting on the line, what that means to your plan administrators and so on and so forth. But a fiduciary is somebody who acts in or on behalf of some other party or parties, trusts, has confidence and has influence over how accounts are invested, choices are made, fees are structured, et cetera, et cetera. So if you are in any way affecting your 401k, your 403b, simple IRA, SEP IRAs, those types of things in smaller businesses, it's likely that you are a fiduciary. So if you are, what are your responsibilities? First and foremost, you have to act in the best interest of those you are making judgments on behalf of. You have to act in the best interest of the employees, ensuring you're using the most beneficial plans and investment choices for all employees. Believe it or not, that last bullet point is a bullet point that comes off of the 408B2 memo that was put forth in early 2012 And 408B2, which we'll be talking a lot about today, was the standardizing of fee disclosure. It helps, fees, it helps the fiduciary and the employees understand what they're looking at. And as you'll see in a later slide, it also opens up a giant door to litigation, unfortunately, on behalf of plan costs. People who believe that they are at prudent levels because nominally it doesn't seem like that much are finding, unfortunately, that prudent levels are ever shrinking at this point in time.
And that whole world has just changed so much over the course of really even just the last 5 years, but dramatically over the last 15.
Absolutely. And you'll see a couple of slides later, you will see how much it has decreased and what that all means. But we need to understand the players in this space and understand why, for those of you who have been following the news closely, why the Supreme Court, why the Appellate Division decided to discard the fiduciary rule as posed by the Department of Labor. That was one such rule that monitors all retirement accounts with a broad brush. So though it would have affected you as a plan fiduciary, it also affects anyone who works with retirement-based accounts. So on the individual side or in the group space, the fiduciary rule was an attempt to homogenize how everybody had to react, what everybody had to do, and so on. The discarding of that, or the pushing it back and placing it on hold, does not dismiss all plan fiduciaries from all sorts of responsibility. We can't exactly jump for joy yet and act as though we have no responsibility, because the plan fiduciary is still bound by the Securities Act of 1974, which is was the start of ERISA, the longstanding Employee Retirement Income and Security Act. Everybody knows as ERISA, makes suggestions and has, since 1974, given us guidelines on what we have to do when we're acting on behalf of others. And that's really the longest standing of the fiduciary guidelines and fiduciary laws at this point in time.
Right. And with or without the DOL rule, whether it gets through or not, there's been hundreds of actual lawsuits that have transpired or and still in the progress right now that really don't have anything to do specifically with that rule. I mean, there may be overlap, but there's a risk to the fiduciary regardless, and the fiduciary has responsibilities regardless of that rule.
Absolutely. So next slide really shows us that ERISA is really the gold standard and what we need to be concerned about. And in 2012, as we mentioned, there was a standardization of fee disclosure known as the 408B2. That was a document that was developed to dig through all the fees and how fees are charged within 401ks, 403bs, all employee-sponsored plans, 457 plans, etc., and disclose these fees to the plan participants. And ERISA tosses around terms such as prudent, requiring fiduciaries when selecting, and moreover, and we'll delve into this a little bit later, monitoring your plan and the service providers to act prudently in the interest of the plan participants and beneficiaries. Also tosses around the term reasonable and reasonable compensation. Now, when I was going through business law classes, prudent and reasonable were always painted as these broad brush things that could be tossed in. And I had I think it was a business law professor say, the finer you make the law, the more loopholes. When you start putting in things such as prudent and reasonable, a lot can jump through that hoop, and that's what we're finding with the litigation, unfortunately, that has been coming into this space. So the fiduciary that's held to a prudent expert standard, Jim, you want to run with this one?
Sure. Well, Rick and I got a kick out of this as we were putting this together, because we kind of like the fact that they define the prudent expert with the word prudence. So, so we're like, that was always breaking the golden rule when you had to do definitions and things back in elementary school. So, but this is the actual definition of it, which is, I'll just read it off because it's so straightforward. With the care, skill, and prudence under the circumstances then prevailing, that a prudent man, person, acting in a like capacity and familiar with such matters would use in the conduct of an enterprise of a like character and with like aims.
So the $25 million question is, how does the prudent person act with prudence? And that's really what we're going to delve into today. We're going to look at the different types of retirement plans on the next slide. Just so we know what we're talking about, pension plans. If you or your employer has a pension plan, if you work in human resources, if you collect documents for your 401k, 403b, 457 enrollments, anything that was established under the Revenue Act of 1978 is a qualified employer-sponsored plan. There are also non-qualified plans known as non-qualified deferred compensation plans. We're not going to delve into those today because they look, smell, and act differently. They are not subject to ERISA, but more designed,
whole different set of rules on that. So
more designed for highly compensated people to peel off and have an exclusive plan. We're not going to touch on those today. We're really touching on the qualified deferred compensation plans. So
if you do deal with non-qualified plans or you have questions about that, feel free to give us you can always contact us with any questions you might have. We'll put up our contact information towards the end.
So we've tossed around ERISA quite a bit, but we need to know how all this dovetails together, because you'll see ERISA, you'll see DOL, and you'll see EBSA, which is the Employee Benefits Security Administration. So we have a hierarchy. The DOL is in charge of all these things. Okay, so this new fiduciary rule doesn't unseat ERISA, or it's not somebody else that's putting this in place. The fiduciary rule would be used in concert with ERISA plans and also non-ERISA plans to demand fiduciary excellence, set guidelines, and take people who are acting as fiduciaries to act truly not to a suitability standard as has been set forth in the private space, but to make sure each and every person that's touching is acting as a fiduciary and fulfilling their responsibilities. So when you look at the Department of Labor and ERISA, 408b2, everything we're going to be talking about is going to fall under the the umbrella, or is a part of the Department of Labor regulations. So as we take a look at that, why are we going to want to focus on fees? Okay, that last slide that we just blazed through just shows that there are $7.3 trillion in assets that are in, go forward one, I'm sorry. $7.3 trillion in assets that somebody or a group of somebodies are acting on behalf of others with. So this is a large market share. You can see 401k plans in the private sector tend to be the largest, but 403bs, take up second place. Other defined contribution plans, we're talking about almost $1 trillion in 403bs, about $5 trillion in 401ks. The onus is on all of these plans similarly or identically, truly, that if you're doing anything or acting in any role with these plans, you are that fiduciary. So 408b2 gave us a homogenization, right? It gave us a standardization of how to disclose fees and where they are. And I don't read too frequently my notes on these things, but I want to make sure that I quote the Department of Labor and the 408b2 regulation directly. So the Employee Benefits Security Administration, the EBSA, is in charge of enforcing and also guidelines for 408b2. And their guideline when this came out was that in recent years, and this is a quote, in recent years, many arrangements on how services are provided to employees and how service providers or compensated have been increasingly complex. So we all sit here and hear that and hear complex as expensive. And it's actually quite the contrary, fortunately, that the complex nature of how fees are charged to retirement plans has created an environment that has reduced costs. And the Employee Benefit Security Administration goes on to say, and quote, many of these changes have improved efficiency and reduced the cost of administrative services and benefits for plans and their participants. And that was the onus to put into place this 408b2 disclosure. So the focus on fees were, and we'll show you in a number of slides, fees have gone down, and unfortunately people haven't stayed current with their responsibility to benchmark, to check into their plans, and determine if they are still relevant, if they are still the lowest and best cost they can possibly be. So what did this do? Look at that list, and that's a short one.
Right, and in addition to that, I was mentioning before, there's been 400 plus lawsuits from 2006 until January of 2018. So a lot of people will say to us when this conversation comes up, well, it's only Home Depot, it's only Walmart, but there are a lot of other companies and even a lot of smaller companies now that are in the mix related to these lawsuits.
Yeah. In putting this together, Jim and I picked kind of the biggest names. Home Depot's the top of the list because it's the most recent, seeking damages of $140 million for, improper investments, but also egregious fees. Norton Healthcare, huge plan, just made a simple mistake or oversight that the share class that they chose was too expensive. Large damages there. And then the last one there, Fidelity, everybody should think that an investment company would not be subject to lawsuits because they would know their vehicles and their cost structures intimately. Fidelity's own employees sued them for mismanagement because fees were too high. These are all born out of, this list anyways, is born out of this 408b2 environment.
And surprisingly too, Rick, with that Fidelity one, I believe that was only one of, I believe there was 40 other financial companies that ended up in the mix on that, where I think they kind of, if I remember right, I think a lot of those were like self-dealing type situations because they were using their own investments and those types of things and that. So that Fidelity isn't a sole sample in that whole situation.
Yep. That's exactly right. And,
and really, Rick, you and I were talking about the other night with the 408b2, it's really the fiduciary's like main weapon, because that is the piece that allows you to have a picture of all the things that are very foggy with these plans. A lot of times people don't know where all the expenses are coming from. There's expenses coming from the funds, there's expenses coming from the administrators, there's all sorts of, record keeper this. You'll see all these different terms, and then sometimes they charge them per person, sometimes they charge an asset-based fee, sometimes there's almost a commission type style with 12b1 fees. So fees come from a whole slew of different areas with these plans, and really that's the one tool that kind of consolidates it all into one spot so that you can get a very clear picture of what's going on.
And as the fiduciary, that's your greatest weapon, but weapons sometimes are double-edged swords. So the next slide you'll look at here, in concert with those 400 lawsuits that have happened up through the end of 2017, look what happened starting in 2013 when the 408b2 regulation went in. If you take a look at the excessive fees section, which is that reddish color, 2014, 15, 16, and 17, it was the largest share driving litigation were excess fees. So, what we're starting to see here is a picture that's shaped by disclosure being very, very important, and now that thing that you as a fiduciary are using to insulate yourself and show that you're doing your due diligence, if you're not then taking that next step and benchmarking a plan, finding out that you are relevant and at lowest cost that you can be in the marketplace, all of a sudden this is opening us up to some litigation. So,
and back on that prior screen, it was kind of surprising. I mean, obviously the increase in the number of lawsuits is going back up, but it still isn't as high as it was in 08 and 9. But you can clearly tell the change in the reason for the lawsuits. You know, back in 08 and 09, it was always inappropriate investment choices. And coincidentally, the market was kind of at its inflection point. So that probably became a little less popular at that point in time. But you can definitely see the reason for the increase is being driven by another cause now, which is probably the 408B2 rule and requirement.
Yeah, if we extrapolate from this graph out the 2008 and 2009 Great Recession, stock market crash, whatever you want to call it, we would see that the gray area is really a mean reversion at this point in time, and the only reason that lawsuits are going up is due to this, self-dealing and excessive fees. Both of those things are truly disclosed on that 408B2.
Correct.
So the next slide is going to take a look at, if this looks like the map to the Holy Grail, you're probably not the only one who sees it that way. You've got participants, you've got your employer, plan sponsor, all fiduciaries. Let's take a look at that on the employer side. At about 2 o'clock, if we look at that as a clock, the record keeper, retirement service provider, and then the investment provider down at 4:30. So there are a number of hands in the pot, and you can see that all compensation is not the same. Some, when bundled all together, cut out fees to the employer and shift it just on the participants. Some employers take the fee and pay to the investment provider. Some the participant takes care of the cost structure for the record keeper. There are a copious number of ways that fees can be charged, and this that complexity that the Employee Benefit Security Administration was referencing, this really puts it into a visible fashion and shows that we're looking at a very, very robust compensation structure, really, that is baked into all retirement plans. So the next logical place to go here would be to understand the fees and understand the differences. So we're going to look at understanding where they come from, how much is being charged, and when. Okay, so we're going to answer the next 3 slides. We'll answer the where, the how much, and when. So let's start with where. This slide takes a look at where funds are being charged, or where funds are being taken from, I should say. And we can see that mutual funds still hold the largest market share in all qualified representative retirement plans. About 60 or 59% in equity mutual funds. You've got hybrid mutual funds, but 63% of all assets within employer-sponsored plans are still in mutual funds. So this is the where. Where is it coming from? Mutual funds. You've got record keeper costs that are within there. That's another place where money is being charged and coming out from. But mutual funds provide simple diversification. So I guess it would bear knowing at this point in time that mutual funds that are being used within plans have changed throughout the past few years. And that's the next, how much. So Jim and I were remarking that the Center for Retirement Research came out with a report that was analyzing all retirement plans, so everything that is ERISA governed, and noticed that the trend was away from actively managed mutual funds to passively managed mutual funds. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily because that was the best investment for participants, but it made it very, very easy to drive down cost.
Right. And we were kind of going down the conversation route of whenever anything always swings like that, there's usually a backside of something bad happening. And does this kind of, that trend of everything moving passive just because the fees are low, which is perfectly fine, and there definitely should be that piece in there, But at some point, is it going to lead to an issue with the employees coming back at the company and say, it's one thing to have passive investments when the market does nothing but go up for the last 10 years. When things become more turbulent and it all goes on and everyone goes down with those index funds, assuming that's what will correct or something at one point, the less active options that the participants have, they may come back and say, hey, you didn't even give me an option where these guys or gals may protect me a little bit, on the active side, which I'm not getting with the passive, but you didn't give me any of those choices. Will it be thrown back in the company's face?
And in our experience, you don't have to choose, or you shouldn't have to choose. You can structure a robust plan with both options, and then the onus would be, a full suite of indexes, a full suite of actively managed funds, and then it's on the employee to choose where they want to go, seek out their own advice, because remember, all of us on the conversation, no, we are not in the business of providing investment advice to our employees. We are in the business of structuring the best possible plan and giving them every single tool to use. But at the end of the day, we can't sit here and when Joe or Mary comes into the office and says, what should I do? We can't say, how old are you? Go use that target date fund, because that opens up a whole other can of worms. But, back to this slide, what we're looking at is, the how much, and how much, when we look at mutual funds, how much is charged and where's it coming from. So if we take a look at this, 2000 through 2016, front-end load funds were much more popular in the year 2000. Those are the old-fashioned, you put in $10, a percentage comes off the top, maybe it's 2%, maybe it's, it can go upwards of 5%. Some of the insurance companies are still using the old 5%, 5.25% model, but the money comes right off the top. So for every $100, if you're charging, 2%, $2 comes off, $98 of the employee's money goes into their account, and the $2 goes to compensate whomever is helping out with the retirement plan. You can see that has lost favor over time, as you would imagine. And then the green bar, which I don't know why it still has the slip of market share that it does, but that's the old-fashioned hidden fee conversation. So any of you who are savvy in investing, who've ever heard of B shares, anybody who has used an annuity-based plan that has a contingent deferred sales charge or withdrawal charge, that's what that green section is. Not going to focus too much on those, because if you're offering those to employees and you're anything other than a sole proprietor, a very, very small plan, I would encourage you to get on board and look at that 90% dealing with no-load funds. 90% making up retail no-load and institutional no-load in the retirement plan space. So as you look at that, no loads, we all think, okay, it's got to be a complementary investment, but we have to define no load for what it is, and that is something that has nothing up front, nothing on redemption, like the front end and the back end sales load, but it does still, or could still, have what's known as a 12B1 fee. And the 12B1 fee is a soft dollar that goes to compensate the administrator, the record keeper, the advisor, could be kicked back to the company in some instances, but no loads could have 12B1 fees as high as 0.25% on an ongoing basis. So, though 90% and no load looks good, again, just because you have a no load plan doesn't necessarily mean that you're investing in the cheapest possible fashion. In our experience in going through benchmarking strategies with folks that we work with, we're finding a lot of people, and that's why I tossed in Jim and I tossed in that Home Depot thing. A no load could be, for example, an R1 or an R5 share class. The 12B1 is not equal there. Institutional share classes, not all created equal any longer. So this just really shows that, how much money is coming depends on what you choose. And though you may be in the 90% of no-load funds, you need to make sure you are in the cheapest of no-load funds. So this last slide takes a look at the when, right? Those are the three questions we were going to answer. when which type of assets are used. And what we're looking at here is that regardless of the size of the plan, you're looking that plan size as it increases, historically speaking, uses or more popular, more likely to use an asset manager. And in our opinion, this is a fallacy in the marketplace right now. This is something that people just believe, oh, I have a small plan, I don't need to use an asset manager because this insurance company has bundled everything together, or I'm direct with my mutual fund company. And unfortunately, if we're doing that for ease, that's costing us significantly.
And you really have to watch that too, where that's one of the main spots where the fiduciary really can get tripped up. Is we met with a lot of companies where they have older plans in place, older insurance company plans in place, and they don't think they're that old. They put them in 10, 12, 13, 14 years ago. They don't, in the person's mind who's running the plan or the fiduciary, they don't think the plan is that old, but that is really a lifetime with what's kind of happened over the last 10 years, 5 years. So
yeah, Jim makes a phenomenal point. The next slide will point out that just over the last 5 years, regardless of the metric that you use to analyze plans, so be it by size, whether we weight it by plan size, participant, or asset size. Just in the 5 years from 2009 to 2014, and I assure you, in our experience, it has happened again from 2014 to current day, overall average plan costs and fees are down. I can't tell you how frequently we run into plans when we're working in this environment, and worked with one non-for-profit plan was it close to 30 years old?
No, it wasn't. It was actually only I think they put it in 13 to 15 years ago.
Okay, so that would be one that may have fallen into the idea that it was in its infancy, but
they didn't think it was old, but yeah. It was old. So
13, 15 years old, and bundled, again, not a huge plan, but fees were way out of the realm when we went through the exercise of benchmarking. So
almost double what the high side is on here for a small plan. So very quickly those plans become kind of outdated or not in step, which is really where we're headed with the benchmarking. You really need to do that, and that's what DOL really wants to happen as well, to make sure that you're able to keep a handle on all this stuff.
And let's take a look at the next slide that really brings into account what average means in our life. The green line, and this is by plan asset size, so assets within a plan. The green line is the average for plans within that size. I like to look at the slide, or all the way over to the right, that just weights all plans. So just because we're falling in an average cost doesn't necessarily mean that we can now, wipe our hands clean, hold our hands up, and say we've done our job. We need to make sure, as the 400 lawsuits give us at least pause, but I would argue give us direction on what we need to be doing, give us true rationale on why we need to truly review what we're looking at within our retirement plan. So if we take a look at that,
because there's definitely factors that come into this. If you end up having, one of the big factors when pricing these plans is asset value per person. So that can definitely have a weight on where this line is and where your numbers fall. But keep in mind, if you are a facility that has a very large per person or even average number, then you shouldn't be looking to reach the average line. You should be looking of saying, I should definitely be down near where that low number is.
And it's not an immaterial amount of money. Those of us who don't look at expense ratios frequently, look at this and say, okay, if we look at the average, 1.5 on the high side to 0.47 on the low side, it's not a huge swing. The top looks at the 90th percentile, and the difference between the bottom and the top there is 1.03%. If we look at, somebody's retirement savings, or an account that we have there with $100,000 in it, your annual difference, if you're in the bottom or the top, is $1,030 on a $100,000 account. So it's not, and that's annually. So it's not an immaterial amount of money. And the next couple of slides really do a couple of great case studies here on nominally what that means.
Yeah, and these are really kind of staggering because the first one assumes, we'll kind of go through these quick so we're not holding up because everyone's always seen how much the interest impacts everything. The first one's assuming a 35 years till retirement, but it's also assuming only a $25,000 balance in the account, average return 7%, no additional investments into that 401k, and it's showing with fees of a half of 1%, so the 50 basis points or the 0.5 versus the 1.5. And it basically gives you a $64,000 difference over that period of time, or 28%. So you can see where those fees really do impact the participant, and hence why it's always become such a big deal with DOL. This is the money people are saving for their retirement. Very few pension plans around anymore. The government wants to make sure that the people aren't getting dinged when they're in these plans, and to make sure that the fiduciary is doing what's in their best interest. The second one is 45 years to retirement, zero balance starting, $5,000 annual investment. Again, the 7% return. With the fee of half of 1%, it would grow to $909,000. With the 1.5 fee, it only grows to $703,000 with a $206,000 difference. So again, I think it was a 30% change. So it really can impact the participant significantly at retirement.
Yeah, and the next slide looks at, and this is, remember the slide going back where inappropriate investments were the most popular reason that lawsuits came into place. Wharton did a study in 2012 and just looked simply that based on an average asset allocation. So just going and finding the average, let's call that an index at this point in time, and looking at the optimal asset allocation. Just the difference between there throughout a career could be made up by working, or the difference, what was lost, the opportunity cost there on not having the optimal asset allocation, could be made up by working for 4 more months. I don't know how many people on the call, if we take a look at the last slide and see $206,000 of difference when fees are high versus on average. I don't know how many people could make $206,000 in 4 months. So this really paints that picture that, if we're focusing on investment options at this point in time in this environment in the market, we're focusing on the wrong thing.
And really, with the actual assets or investments that you have in there, it really comes down to, did the fiduciary follow a procedure? Did you do what you should do to get the right investment options in there? What the results of those investment options, what they produce, isn't really the part that hangs over the fiduciary. Did they all have to perform, like Warren Buffett investments? No, it's purely, did you go through a process? Did you document what you were doing, why you were, including certain investments, maybe replacing them at certain points? That's the important part. But like Rick said, the significant impact generally usually doesn't run between whether you have the absolute optimal, combination of investments. It really, for the participant, comes back to the fee and whether, the fee was too high.
So the last slide before we really delve into what benchmarking is, what it looks like, and what you should have in your file, is a look at age and vintage of plans. So this is what we come into most frequently, being people say, oh no, I've recently changed my plan, and it winds up being falling within that lower graph. Depending if you extrapolate out the number of people that are just bundled, or if you just look in a straight line fashion of those who have had their plans in place for over 5 years, we're looking at between 66 and 72%. In light of the additional information that we've looked at here, that plans have varied greatly, at least over the past 5 years, past 10 years definitely, with some of the evidence that we've looked at. Costs have decreased significantly, again, especially in the last 5 years. We need to have that process in place for monitoring. More often than not, it's that ongoing monitoring process where people open themselves up to that fiduciary negligence or liability.
And that's a good point, Rick, too. I think a lot of times the fiduciaries think, hey, we put our plan in place. It wasn't that long ago. Pat themselves on the back, say, we did a great job screening. We went to RFP. We did all this stuff. We did all these things to ensure that our plan was and our participants were covered and protected. And even though they didn't do anything bad along the way, just the change in the environment has kind of put them at risk now.
Yep.
And that's where, as we start talking about benchmarking, that's why that is so significant.
So let's jump into how we clear that hurdle, and I think why everybody's on this call today is how do I, adhere to the best practices? How do I make sure I don't open myself that weapon in that 408B2 becomes my best friend, not that double-edged sword that can cut me on the backswing. So, truly, if you're not benchmarking your plan in a very frequent fashion, you need to be as the fiduciary. So benchmarking is really taking your plan, all facets of your plan. So holdings, costs, participation matrices, and honestly, it is the responsibility of the fiduciary to educate and get some sort of education out there, inviting employees to participate. And that should be a matrix that's used within your benchmarking, but it's taking your plan and comparing it to the overall environment to make sure you're A, still current, B, your investments have been operating at least on par, and C, and perhaps most importantly, in adherence with 408B2, that your fees are still in line with the overall environment. So the Department of Labor, Jim actually had a great conversation with a gentleman there at the DOL, and again, with that whole prudent idea and best practices and whatnot, what is...
Yeah, they're very kind of cagey when you talk to them. They don't really give you, which it was intentional. Everything is very vague. It says, you should do everything, prudent, reasonable. All those words keep coming out. And the same thing with this piece was, I kept saying, how often do you need to benchmark? What is the requirement? Why didn't you guys set an actual time? And they said, because we want it to be as necessary. So if it's necessary, or you believe it's necessary, or the market dictates it's necessary, then you should be doing it. And they're like, we're not going to tell you it's 2 years if there's some significant change to the market and it was 6 months, then, or, something changed in the last 6 months, then you have to do it at 6 months. So that was kind of their whole argument was, we'll never give you a timeline because then it puts us on the hook. Because if we made it too short, then, or too long rather, then, the participants are at risk, and that's the fiduciary's job to kind of monitor that time.
And, I think Jim hit the nail on the head best. It just takes the onus and shifts it back onto the fiduciary to keep abreast of everything, to keep relevant with the times. But FI 360 is a leader in the Global Fiduciary Standard. And they suggest that in a non-changing, a stagnant environment, best practice at this point in time is your benchmarking needs to be done with a 3-year frequency. Okay, if something changes, obviously need to do this more readily, more often. But their guidance was every 3 years you should have a benchmarking done of a plan to make sure you are fulfilling your role completely. So what may change? Why might you need to benchmark your plan more frequently? Well, it could happen internally within your plan, or it could be an extraneous factor. But participation grows. That's a great thing. Assets grow. Also a great thing. But that means your plan size grows. And that also means that maybe a plan that was set up 3 years ago or 5 years ago that's had significant growth all of a sudden is no longer priced properly for the size of the plan. The companies that you work with, maybe their fees have reduced internally, and unless you reach out and make that phone call, you're not going to get the new pricing structure. And we've seen that a host of times. Certain companies just have the old plans, and that's what it is. And if you come in for a new plan, your fees change, go down significantly, but you have to proactively do that. Benchmarking your plan will tell you that. Also, the scope of services required by the fiduciary may have changed, right? The things that you're offering, the things that you need to offer may have changed because the environment has changed. The last 10 years is a perfect way to look at the fiduciary onus getting grander and grander and grander, either by laws that were put into place, 408b2, the attempt at the fiduciary rule, or the legal environment surrounding retirement plans. People who may not have saved properly want to find a deep pocket to find a little bump in their retirement plan.
And a lot of the fees related to these plans switched from what would be a commission type style, the 12b1 style, to an asset-based fee, which really reduces the conflict of interest, because then it's not driven by the actual investments and the commissions coming off of that. So that was a significant change. The other significant change too is there's a large movement away from kind of the structured plans to what's called an open architecture type design, which allows the fiduciary to pick and choose what they want in the plan from almost anything that's available versus picking from just a handful of investments.
So for your file, when you go and you find, and our interest in this is to go and find an independent specialist in retirement plans, obviously, to have a benchmarking analysis done. It should be done on a complementary basis. But you as the fiduciary need to have a document such as this in your file. If you want to follow the Department of Labor's rule as often as necessary, sometimes every year, if you want to file or follow the FI 360 standard every 3 years, but you need to have something in here to prove that you've taken a look at your plan, you know what the costs are, you know what the investment diversification is, you know who's contributing and how much, not necessarily who individually, how much. So we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's, and we have a document in our file that says, yes, we benchmarked our plan, these are the analytics, we are comfortable. This also could help with the investment steering committee if your plan has an investment steering committee. This is what the demographic of our plan looks like internally, and this is something that we're going to put in the file, and that's going to help us should something present itself down the road.
Yeah, if you end up in one of those 400 plus mentioned lawsuits, you want to have it documented that you did your fiduciary due diligence, and this is really one of the documents that's going to prove that.
The next slide looks at investment performance. Again, we need to compare our performance to our peer group, not just to an index. What that means is we don't compare the return in our cash account to the S&P 500. That's just not reasonable. But we need to know what's happening within our plan. And this is yet another page out of a benchmarking analysis that we have a lot of success using. The next one looks at fees, how they're charged, where they're coming out of, who's paying them. Again, this is a page from that benchmarking report, and again takes a look at by participation in certain funds. That's the next one that we need to look at. This takes a look at diversification and the comparison. So, what are we holding? What are our people using? How large are the footprints? Do we have the right asset mix? So do we have the proper number of choices in all the different areas? And in our experience, we would suggest you have passive strategies with a full suite of investment options and active strategies with a full suite of investment options, so as not to open yourself up to any additional question or liability. So this one, again, is kind of, I think, one of the most important in the benchmarking. Takes a look at overlap. So if we have a large cap value fund and then we have the S&P 500 index, we know those two statistically are equal. So, certain people may contend that we shouldn't have overlap within a portfolio. This takes a look at an X-ray of your retirement plan, points out where your holdings are unique, and then also where there are other investment options that may be available that do not have such overlap. Again, benchmarking plan helps you mitigate risk. We're just going to finish out here with a case study, and this was one plan that we worked through. This takes a look at a plan that was not terribly old. Takes a look at a plan about $20 million in size, 182 participants, and just shows that this plan was egregiously out of whack with the average of their plan size, of their plan type. For what they were holding, they were well out of kind of the best practice, that average.
And the crazy thing with it is you can see from the numbers on, I forget what slide it was when we were showing you the numbers from 2014 or whatever it was, where the average was, they actually weren't that far. They were at 0.91 if you looked on the bottom line of where they fell. And I believe the average on that slide for the size plan this was 0.88. So they actually weren't hugely out of line. They were falling in that average category. But again, because their average assets per person were around $100,000 or somewhere in that range, it entitled them to a significantly lower cost. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at these. There's a lot of factors that come into play, and if you haven't actually received some other options, and that's kind of part of benchmarking too, is to ensure where you're falling into the market. If you can't really do it by just taking one company's word of this is what the average is, or even using those charts, you do need to get a couple comparisons to go against to prove that you were doing your due diligence on this stuff.
And quantifying that is a portion of what we're working with. It's a portion of what we need to look at as fiduciaries. So the difference in cost for this specific plan on a 20-year time horizon for the individual participant would have been about $42,000. For the plan itself, over that same period of time, looking at about $7.8 million. And this fee, again, wasn't going from that 1.5 that the slide Jim was referencing. 1.5 was the top 90% cost. This was right in the middle, just looking at other comparable plans, similar size, similar asset levels. So this is something that you need to be doing to adhere to your fiduciary responsibility. When the fiduciary rule itself hit a snafu, some people jumped for joy because it felt that it released them from obligation. It didn't, and it doesn't. And those of you on the call today that we're looking at that are making determinations on a group-sponsored plan truly have to adhere to this fiduciary standard. And the best practice is to make sure you know the environment, make sure you know who's overlooking your plan, monitor your plan on an ongoing basis, because any number of lawsuits, the last hurdle where people didn't clear was you set it and you let it go. You didn't monitor your plan. And benchmarking is that last piece. We need to, and it's our recommendation to you, that you need to be benchmarking your plan frequently on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, anything we discussed today, I know we're kind of pushing up against the hour. Feel free to, you can type in any questions, or our email addresses are here. You can always reach out and contact us. If you don't have a resource for providing you with a complimentary benchmarking report, also feel free to, you can touch base with jlane, who works with us, and we'll get back to you. It is something that we can help you out with. Definitely should be able to find a resource that's not going to charge you to do those benchmarking reports.
And last but not least, people hear this, and we've run this presentation a number of times, and people think that our horse in the race is to change your retirement plan. I assure you, that's not it. We want to help with your adherence to your fiduciary, to fulfill your fiduciary standard. We're just looking to get that document to as many people on an ongoing basis. If your plan's out of whack, you can at least be informed at that point, and then you can make any decision you want. But we'd be very happy, as Jim said, to run a complimentary benchmarking report for you, so you can put it in your file and you can do what you need to do. You can reach out to Jackie. She schedules for us. Email either of us. That would be fine as well. We appreciate your time today. Jim's going to open up the lines here so we can field any questions with the time that you have. We hope this was informative for you, and thank you for taking the time today.
Yeah. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the question section. There's been a few that, actually, maybe I can unmute. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can unmute, because fair number. I'm trying to unmute, but it doesn't seem to want to let me.
All right, I guess we're looking at typed questions. If you have a question, you want to type it out to us.
Here we go. Okay. User error. So if anyone has any questions, feel free. You're unmuted. Okay. Well, if there's no questions, we'll let everyone move on with their day. We do appreciate your attendance, and again, if there's anything or any questions additionally that you have, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll get you whatever information is that would be helpful. And thank you very much for attending.
Yeah. Yeah.